This video is sponsored by Sony Pictures Entertainment. 28 Years Later is exclusively in theaters now. 28 Days Later is also available on digital.
Moving up and down again. Men go mad with watching them. There's no discharge in the war.
It always felt inevitable we would one day return to this unforgivingly bleak, brutal, and yet somehow beautiful world brought to life by director Danny Boyle and writer Alex Garland, and really there is no better time than in today's post-pandemic climate. The original 28 Days Later was conceived around the notion of the what if, surrounding pandemics, viruses, diseases, mutation, bioweapons, civil unrest, global instability, and, well, the perpetual fear that mankind was always teetering on the brink of collapse. In fact, not only was the film produced during the 2001 epidemic of foot and mouth disease in the UK, but it was shot in the midst of 9/11, thus timely reflecting what Danny Boyle later described as a film about social malaise. In my perspective, it was inherently melancholic and meditative amidst the savagery of both man and animal, as it explored both social rage and our collective sense of unease and uncertainty, a shared gut feeling that life and the world around us just doesn't feel right anymore, and we may never return to normality. Over 2 decades later, 28 Years Later is the natural and fitting extension of this feeling, as it takes place almost 3 decades after an experimental rage virus was unleashed upon and eventually contained within Britain that caused humans to become aggressive and feral and be driven by a pure desire to simply infect and spread the virus. Britain is now a global pariah under strict quarantine, with the story focusing on a gated community fortified on the tidal island of the Holy Land in Northumberland that survives on a primitive, self-sufficient way of life. However, to maintain what the villagers consider their sanctuary, they must still scavenge and harvest from the mainland that broodingly lingers in the distance, a land which Danny Boyle describes as a place of both promise and threat. Promise of hope beyond the boundaries of the water, and threat of the infected that freely roam the land. So this is going to be an odd one. If you're familiar with my content, you know that I rarely cover recent releases, but for some unbelievable reason, Sony Pictures wanted to partner with me to make this video possible. And being that this is my most anticipated film of the year based on one of my favorite films of all time, there was no way I was going to turn down such a profound opportunity to fly out to London, get an advanced screening of the film, attend the world premiere, and interview director Danny Boyle, writer Alex Garland, and stars Jodie Comer, Aaron Taylor-Johnson, and Alfie Williams. Now rest assured, I have complete independent and creative freedom to make the video that I want, but I still am going to avoid major spoilers given that this is a fresh release. I want to preserve as much of the mystery as I can for those who have yet to see the film, which is exclusively in theaters June 20th, but I cannot guarantee your safety, so tread lightly as we explore the characters, the setup, the story, and of course the overall world of 28 Years Later. I can't believe I'm doing this. Naturally, I think it's best we start with the major element I imagine most people want to know about, and that is the infected. 28 Years Later immediately elevates them to a harrowing new level by focusing on the natural and inevitable mutation of the virus that results in new variants that are thoughtfully integrated into the world and tie perfectly with the continuity of the original.
There are concerns that new diseases do arise and will arise. That's the whole nature of evolution.
As established at the end of 28 Days Later, where some infected are seen dying of starvation and malnourishment, the film consistently reminds us that they are fundamentally still living, breathing humans who need to eat, sleep, and drink to survive. It wasn't just their acute desperation to survive that persistently stood out to me, but also the unique nuances to their impulsive, twitchy choreography led by movement coach Toby Sedgwick, who I didn't actually know played the infected priest in the original film. To me, it heightens this underlying insinuation that the infected are internally battling against the virus to hopelessly regain control of their bodies. There's a subtle tinge of resistance, like something has hijacked their motor functions. It's not just scarier, it's also just deeply disturbing. Hell, it is pure psychological body horror, in fact. I find myself pondering the humanity still buried within the infected, which the film even addresses late into the story. Now, as for the two new variants introduced, they are both of opposite extremes. You have these devolved, bloated, pustuous ones that crawl on all fours and eat worms and dirt, and then of course you have these absolute units, these shredded alpha types, whose bodies have basically metabolized the virus like a steroid or growth hormone. The point is to not only intensify the horror and dramatics, but to explicitly mirror the natural order of the animal kingdom, with the film even using recurring animal motifs as established in the original film, where we all have to collectively adapt to a new way of life.
It kind of feels like there's ways, especially the way you shot it, it felt like almost like, this maybe sounds very reductive, maybe I'm not trying to make it sound reductive, like animal, like a nature documentary kind of feel, like the way the nighttime cinematography works.
You keep being sort of apologetic about what you're saying, and then say something like completely on point and insightful. We literally talked about the animal kingdom like it was a sort of David Attenborough documentary.
Okay.
Yeah, because like if you on your own, you know, you're a sort of fit, healthy young guy, and if someone said to you, no, more than me, and if someone said, go and kill that deer with your bare hands, you wouldn't be able to, because you wouldn't be able to get your hands on the deer. So we knew the infected were not supernatural. We knew they had to eat and drink in order to stay alive. They've been alive for 28 years. Even if they were infected 6 months ago, they would still have to survive 6 months, right? So they need to eat and drink. And that meant they had to hunt in packs. If you get a pack working together in the animal kingdom, you get an alpha. And so it'll be the alpha in the wolf pack or the gorilla pack or chimpanzees or whatever it happens to be. And then we also thought not everybody is suited to hunting in a pack. Maybe some of them are moving more slowly and staying close to the ground, and they're eating worms and beetles and things like that. So it's pure animal kingdom, just exactly as you intuited.
The human story of 28 years later revolves around a young boy called Spike, as he comes to understand the world and the infected through the differing perspectives of his parents Jamie and Isla, and a reclusive doctor who lives on the mainland called Ian Kelson. His father Jamie internalizes tremendous trauma and rage as he attempts to balance his battle-hardened demeanor with the sensitivity of being a father. He tells Spike that the infected have no souls, and the more he kills, the more desensitized he'll become to it, and thus the easier it will be. Whereas Isla doesn't want Spike to forget his innocence, even begging Jamie not to take Spike to the mainland to perform a rite of passage of killing his first infected.
But I think he's projecting a lot onto his son, a lot of pressure, a lot of fear, and you sort of understand why. You know, he's traumatized from this event that happened 28 years ago, but his son's looking for light and hope, and we're all coming from a sort of survivalist defense kind of place, you know. And
what she's trying to instill in his son is this sense of humanity, of levity, of tenderness, of being connected, of engagement, like. And I think that's what you see in that moment, is that there is no us and them, and actually this is a need to be here for somebody else who was a person. And I don't think she's consciously calculating all this in that moment, but it's her instinct, you know, whereas Jamie's instinct is the opposite. That's the kind of place that she's coming from.
By building the world through diverse and conflicting perspectives giving to Spike, it establishes a strong coming-of-age through line where Spike feels loosely modelled off Jim's own journey in 28 Days Later, where he aspires for hope and maybe a cure, but is gradually grounded to the world and his place within it.
We just see Spike mature throughout this full film. I mean, from playing with, you see him at the start with superhero figures and that, and he has to learn to let go of all the childish things to survive in this post-apocalyptic world.
I won't spoil any specific scenes, but Garland shared a particularly keen insight to me about how there's a distinct contrast between Jimmy projecting his view of the infected onto Spike, and how Isla and Dr. Kelson view them with more compassion and humanity.
There's a contrast in the film to do with the way Spike's dad sees the infected in exactly the way you described, making it easy to kill them. They're sort of like subhumans. The sort of blooding of the kid is a rite of passage, and the way he sees the infected, and then that's contrasted later with the way Ray Fiennes' character sees the infected, and the contrast in the way he deals with an infected, how he perceives them, and also in the Bone Temple itself, which is a memorial that does not differentiate between the infected dead and the non-infected dead.
In fact, there's arguably something to be said about how the villagers react to Spike's first kill with an almost seemingly tribalistic mindset, strangely relishing in the kills, much to Spike's own disillusionment. The return to a primitive way of life in 28 years later strongly compounds the core notion conveyed in the original that life is and will always be survival of the fittest. And when accounting for how mankind's arrogance perhaps one day ensures our own self-annihilation, I'm reminded of Major Henry West's bluntly honest perception that, as a soldier, all he's seen in life is people killing people.
Which is much what I saw in the 4 weeks before infection and the 4 weeks before that, and before that, as far back as I care to remember, people killing people.
Now, if you've seen the trailers, you will have heard the use of Rudyard Kipling's 1903 poem Boots, which was said to depict the British Army's marching during the Second Boer War. It comes into effect when Spike and Jamie leave their home and venture to the mainland for the first time, accompanied by military archive footage, as though to evoke a sort of PSA that you are entering hell, a place of death and no return. There is nobody coming to save you. I did ask Alex and Danny about the thematic use of it, and it seems the point was to place us into the mentality Jamie has conditioned Spike into perceiving regarding the mainland and the infected. It emphasizes a sort of ritualistic necessity for killing, or as Alex called it, the bloodening of Spike, as a way to prepare him for this bleak and brutal world, which is later contrasted with Kelson's methods to pacify the infected. However, while that militant mindset remains when Jamie is by Spike's side, if you saw my video on the original 28 Days Later many years ago, I focused a lot on what I thought were potential religious undertones, and so I was eager to see if that was intentional here as well, given how the setup is effectively a pilgrimage from the Holy Land into a figurative hell to perform a ritual. I'll concede I'm probably trying to force a bit of a read in here given how I feel about the original film, which Danny supportfully suggested, but there are other elements such as an alpha infected that Kelson calls Samson, happily named after the man who tore open the lion's jaw in the Bible. There's a distinctive church sequence, and let's just call it a rebirth moment that will make sense to those who see the film. And then most acutely, the film reuses the poem Abide With Me during a classroom scene. This poem is particularly interesting to me because it was written by a poet dying of tuberculosis and finding peace before death, and was thematically appropriate to Jim finding his deceased parents in 28 Days Later, and to use it again here ties into the ultimate theme of the Bone Temple. Now, until I see the film several more times, which is very likely for me, I can only say that these things are what I feel are in the film. Danny and Alex did allude to more we've yet to see in this world, but specifically for these references, it didn't seem explicitly written with these in mind. But nonetheless, I appreciated them just humoring my cringe-inducing geek-out moment anyway.
So I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, if there's anything in there that's true, or I'm just talking a lot of shit.
It's not a lot of shit. It's fascinating and wonderful that you can riff on it, and your interest in religion in it is really acute, because Alex and I, if we've ever had a falling out, it was kind of a spiritual one, really, I think, probably to do with sunshine.
Danny Boyle's reference to the thesis of Jurassic Park that nature always finds a way, whether it be beautiful or an abomination, calls back to that social malaise and that feeling that will never return to normality. West's belief that humanity is doomed to create violence, rage, and destruction, symbolized by the purity of what the virus is only ever challenged by Sergeant Farrell, who tells us,
"Man has only been around for a few blinks of an eye, so if the infection wipes us all out, that is a return to normality."
The reason I specifically highlight this reference is because 28 years later is confirmation of these very words. It's a world where nature is fully in control and we're in no position to argue, adapt or die because nature will simply move on without us. When we step into the shoes of Spike, we see the community framed as very rigidly close-knit, bordering on oppressive even, and it contrasts with the openness of the mainland in an ironically poetic way. It's interesting how the sanctuary and safety of the island is bleak, moody and overcast, and basically absent of colour, compared to the beautifully vibrant vistas and colour palette that we see in this perilous mainland. In fact, fashion designer Gareth Pugh, working on production and costume, said the island's muted colours were inspired by post-industrial Glasgow, and by sharply contrasting it with the natural beauty of the mainland, much like how the first film meditated on the melancholic beauty amongst the bleakness, reflects Spike's wonder and curiosity towards this big bad world. It makes the mainland seem almost transcendent in a way. It tempts Spike with its majesty and freedom as he wonders what truly lies beyond, and it's upon taking his mother Isla to Dr. Kelson in the hopes of curing her sickness that he comes to see the world in a way that isn't as close-minded as his father wants him to believe. It's here where we witness Kelson's Shrine of the Dead, a literal bone temple that, as Garland explained, doesn't discriminate between infected and non-infected, as we are all ultimately one and of the same. Kelson shares with Spike the Latin phrase memento mori, remember death, remember that you are going to die. It isn't a cynical and nihilistic statement, but one that helps Spike come to terms with life's only certainty. It consolidates the themes of the film by showing that every skull is a memory, a life lived.
There is definitely a movement from absolute horror to what you think is going to be even more horror. It turns out not to be. It turns to be a movement towards compassion in a way, or as Alex says, a man who sees humanity in all, regardless of the way they're defined by other people.
Danny has said he was inspired by the Kofod Memorial Wall in London, and this gives the temple its real-world emotional impact. Every life is precious in its own way and has a story to tell, and we mustn't forget those who were once here. Considering Dr. Kelson is distinctly a general practitioner for the NHS, it hits strongly on a personal level, as he bears the weight of seeing death around him, having devoted his life to unflinching and vigorous compassion in the face of sickness. Look, in my many years covering horror, I probably said the word memento mori at least once. It's a pretty familiar saying within the genre, but then the film profoundly subverts it by having Kelson tell Spike another life lesson. Memento amores. Remember to live, remember to love. In times of stress, desperation, and uncertainty, we often forget what's important, and I personally know that firsthand. That's why the film hit so hard in the end. In the shadow of death, we still move through life as one, so we shouldn't close ourselves off from others or experiencing life. No matter what time we have left in a world as fragile as this, perhaps the best thing we can do is not waste it in fear.
When you see the second film, you'll have plenty to riff about. Won't he? Yeah. Holy shit, he's going to have stuff about... It's wonderful to hear you interpret it like that.